Hi, welcome back. My name is Jonathan and welcome to Software Design from the Beginning. We're just going to continue on from where we were talking about structuralism and paradigms. What I would just like to do is introduce you very briefly to various types of paradigms. So here we have object-oriented paradigm. So in this we have the sort of concept of objects, and we're manipulating and subscribing to things in an object-oriented way. We're moving objects around. We're putting behavior onto objects. Object-oriented is a paradigm. It's well received pretty much in the community. Domain-driven design is built along this concept, although it has other conceptual layers. We also have agent-oriented. And agent-oriented is quite different to objects, worth having a look at. We need to understand as many paradigms as possible because all scenarios that we're faced with in different industries, different problems, they require very distinct solutions. And if we only understand the object-oriented programming kind of way of doing things, or maybe we're a functional programmer, we'll only understand and use that one tool to fit all of our problems. So basically using one tool to fix everything. Hammer, everything's a hammer. We have the solution. If we understand multiple paradigms, we can begin to understand and reason about other types of solutions and possibilities. For example, event-driven is another entirely different paradigm where we're basically subscribing to events, and when an event fires, we then react, and that's an entirely different way of thinking. We also have things based around role, as in role-oriented, and something like use case-oriented, and in fact we get a lot of different architectures that come about from this kind of way of thinking. For example, if I say component architecture, then of course you could see that components could relate to objects quite easily, right? There is some kind of connection there. Event-driven, well, yeah, that could fit in with that component architecture. All components could have events. We could look at other architectures that relate as well. So if I say MVC, Model View Controller, there is a relationship to the kinds of paradigms that it uses. There's one here, DCI by James Copeland, which is worth looking into. And this is, if I can put it briefly, kind of a use case / role oriented. It's kind of a little bit of both of that. And so understanding different architectures and paradigm and what really fits together is really important for understanding how your domain design or your model fits within this world. So if I go to the other side, what we're really saying here is that we have a domain model, possibly written in a domain language of some kind. I mean, we can model, with business modeling, we can reason about business and processes and actors within that system. So there is kind of a divide here. The divide perhaps has been blurred, or because it's not understood, could just be conceived as being, or perceived as being similar or the same. But there are differences. The domain model and what we're doing with the domain and the domain language is really important. And how we kind of reason about use case, we might get that from this side of the fence and use it. Object-oriented might be this side of the fence. Role is trying to bridge the gap between these two systems or ways of thinking. So paradigms are, if we look at it from this point of view, also incredibly important for understanding how to design a system. If we look at service-oriented architecture or SOA, or this trend at the moment to use APIs for everything, you could find yourself sitting in a CRUD-like service-oriented architecture, and you have to ask yourself, is that the best way to express a domain model, for example? How is the domain being declared and represented by objects, by agents, by events, and so on? And how conducive is that for future-proofing the application, for brittleness and complexity, and so on? What I'd advise you do is learn as many of these paradigms as you can. The aim here is to build small projects, build something with object-oriented, build something with role-oriented, where you're considering use cases and event-driven. It's very important to get an understanding of these things so that you understand what to use, what tool to use in what given scenario. It's probably also worth mentioning that all these kinds of things, like functional programming, this kind of paradigm / architecture, they're different things, but I'm putting them roughly together at the moment. If I look at functional approaches, or I look at other paradigms such as flow-based or pipes, filters, that kind of architecture, you can see how a system would grow in an entirely different direction. So, how do we reason about a domain if we've got a term like book and, let's say, an order and, let's say, price and, let's say, delivery, and we're doing all these kinds of things with a domain kind of view on the world? How do we reason about these things and the relationship and the flow and the order? One could say that in an object-oriented, well, I've got a book, that's great. I could have some behavior on it, book.order, something like that. I could have an agent-oriented, so now it's not just the book, but I do have somebody, perhaps like a salesperson who could come in and do the sale. And they look and connect this kind of approach, so the person is somewhat related to the book in order, and the salesperson is connected very much to the buyer. This is an actor-based. You could almost say, well, maybe that's role-based. Perhaps that's not purely agent-oriented. But there are obviously subtle differences between that. The relationships that we draw between these things could represent flow or attributes or other types of relationships, and how we map this onto variations of architectures, paradigms. These are the things that make for good, elegant design when you get it right, or of course great complexity and unnecessary complexity when you get it wrong. If we go back and look at our conceptual layers, if we look at, well, what is a business layer, right? Let's just look at that as an example. Well, how does that fit into an architecture? How does that fit into a paradigm, connect into our domain, right? What are we going to put in our business layer? If we look at structuralism, what are we going to put in the business layer? But what does that book mean? What attributes and other language and terms and signifiers do we place around that book? How do people understand that term? And if we've got more than a business layer, if we've got some kind of service layer, what resides in these layers? Now, architecturally speaking, we could also say, how smart is something? Is a book a smart object in some way? Does it know how to look after itself? Now, when I use the word smart, all I'm really meaning in some way is that it can look after itself, or another way of saying is that maybe it has encapsulation of its own behavior of some kind. And so how you reason about a domain and describe and give power to an architecture and a paradigm really dictates how your system is going to grow. And so without experience in these kinds of things and not understanding object-oriented, for example, or agent-oriented, or the mixture between them, understand the boundaries, not understanding the business layer or layer architecture or DCI, how can we really reason about a system building some stuff? So as you start your design journey, you might be looking at design patterns and architectures, and these are all great. You might even look at a cloud platform, and it comes with components and dependencies. And a lot of those things really understand this kind of level of detail and has used it and implemented various combinations of these ways of reasoning. But do you understand the philosophy behind that dependency? And when you put that dependency together with another, perhaps the paradigm is different and you're not able to see that. And that could create some complexity. In a nutshell, to wrap up this episode, I really just wanted to outline how architecture, paradigms, domain models, how they kind of sort of treat each other, how you can use them together, how systems out there are based on a particular architecture or based on a particular paradigm, and how careful we have to be. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.